Bueno, bienvenidos al primer panel del tercer día. Hoy tendremos el panel de Filosofía del Derecho Internacional a cargo de Patricia Mindus como ponente, que presentará el Philosophical Turn in Migration Theory, y como contraponente tendremos a Natalia, Castro, Niño. Me gustaría poder compartir un momento una pantalla mientras hago la presentación. Patricia Mindus es profesora de Filosofía Práctica en la Universidad de Uppsala, es directora del Uppsala Forum for Democracy, Peace and Justice, y también es presidenta de la Swedish Section of the International Association for Philosophy of Law and Social Philosophy. Es autora de libros como European Citizenship After Brexit, A Real Mind, The Life and Work of Axel Hagerström, lo siento Patricia si lo pronunció no muy bien, y recientemente se ha publicado en Marcial Pons su primer libro en español, Hacia una teoría funcionalista de la ciudadanía. De su enorme lista de publicaciones, quiero destacar que el año pasado ha sido coeditora del número especial Women Contemporary Philosophy, Voices from Scandinavia, publicado en la revista.
Yo estoy de acuerdo con Flavia en...
Ok. Yo no sé si estar de acuerdo con Flavia, pero puedo decir que del gran currículum de Patricia hay una línea invisible que me gustaría destacar, y es que ella es la primera mujer en ser promovida a profesora de filosofía práctica en la Universidad de Uppsala desde el año en que ésta fue fundada, es decir, desde el año 1477. Asimismo, y este es uno de los puntos que une a nuestra ponente con nuestra contraponente, Patricia, en el 2010, fue Visiting Fellow de la Universidad de Girona. Natalia Castro Niño, por su parte, es docente investigadora de la Universidad Externado de Colombia, es doctora en Derecho en la Universidad París I Panteón Sorbonne, es directora en la Universidad Externado de la línea de investigación sobre declaración de responsabilidad internacional por parte de jurisdicciones internas, es miembro de la Sociedad Francesa para el Derecho Internacional, es miembro de la Academia Colombiana de Derecho Internacional y es miembro del capítulo Colombia de la Sociedad Internacional de Derecho Público. Y también, como no, ha sido Visiting Fellow de la Universidad de Girona en el año 2016. Ahora, ¿por qué esta imagen que tenemos de fondo? Quisiera, como han hecho mis colegas en las mesas precedentes, quisiera llamar la atención sobre un asunto. Y para eso quiero poner una pregunta. La pregunta es, ¿dónde están las mujeres en las publicaciones académicas? La revista Icon, en su editorial de enero del 2020, expresó su preocupación por el número y la proporción decreciente de autoras, en disminución durante los últimos 3 años. Solo un 34% de los artículos enviados en 2016 fueron de autores. Pero ese porcentaje disminuyó en 2017 al 32%, y en 2018 se redujo al 30%. Y si bien la tasa de aceptación de artículos presentados por mujeres en la revista durante esos años resulta ser más alta que la tasa de aceptación de artículos presentados por hombres, el resultado final es que poco más de un tercio de los artículos que aparecieron en Icon de 2016 a 2018 fueron escritos por mujeres. Para dar un ejemplo de una de las revistas de nuestras áreas, en Rebus, por ejemplo, excluyendo el número especial de la primera edición de este congreso, en los últimos 2 años la proporción de artículos enviados por mujeres fue un 10%. La proporción de mujeres que fueron evaluadoras, que hicieron el light peer review, es de un 16%. Y de todos los artículos publicados, un 23% son escritos por mujeres. O sea, y esto, el número 23%, casi todo lo que las mujeres envían supera la evaluación anónima, aunque ésta sea hecha en su gran mayoría por hombres. Para cerrar este punto con una sonrisa y no cayendo en depresión, quiero mencionar dos cosas. Uno, el libro más discutido en nuestra área actualmente, que suscitó y suscita amplios debates y números especiales en diversas revistas, es afortunadamente de una teórica del derecho. Me refiero al libro de Cristina Redondo. También, uno de los libros más vendidos de la editorial Marcial Pons es el libro de Carmen Vázquez. Finalmente, y para concluir, y con esto ya le doy la palabra a Patricia, en pandemia, y con esto me refiero a ahora, desde hace un año, el número de artículos enviados por mujeres para evaluación, a que me refiero en general y yo no a ninguna revista en particular, ha disminuido en forma considerable. Con la escuela a distancia, los grupos burbujas, los protocolos de aislamiento por COVID, una vez más, la responsabilidad del cuidado recae mayormente sobre las mujeres. Por ello, las organizadoras del Congreso queremos agradecer a todas las ponentes, a todas las contraponentes y a las asistentes por el esfuerzo que han hecho para estar presentes, pero sin dejar de notar que una vez más, las mujeres estamos sorteando esos obstáculos extra que tanto nos cuesta. Bueno, con esto le doy la palabra a Patricia para que comience su presentación. Patricia, tienes unos 40 minutos para tu presentación. Si alguien quiere hacer preguntas, es como los días pasados, pueden utilizar el chat, y para los asistentes, el preguntas y respuestas.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can share the screen properly here. Okay. So first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored to have been invited to this conference. And I have to, in particular, say that I've been very interested in hearing the different ponencias and contraponencias that I think have been of a very high quality, and I've learned a lot. So thank you. I also want to point out that I thank particularly Carmen Vasquez and Lorena Ramirez, who was organizing this, and also Victoria Istostrozak for the organizing of the event, and also for being part of the conception of the event that I think is important to underline. I also want to thank Natalia Castro Niño from the Universidad, Externado de Colombia, who has nicely agreed to be the discussant on this paper, and I hope she will show some leniency in doing so later on. Now, let me add that in a world of manels, that's all male panels, it is a pleasure to see so many gifted women show their intellectual talent in a respectful way on such a variety of topics that we see here. So it almost made me forget that we're not seeing each other in real life, as they say nowadays, but I hope we will make up for that soon enough. And then discúlpeme de dar mi ponencia en inglés, a pesar de todos los años que he pasado en el mundo latino y a pesar de varios miembros de mi familia que hablan español y también catalán, mi capacidad de hablar en castellano es perfectamente inexistente. Sin embargo, puede entender sus preguntas en español y la recibiré de buen grado. So let me start from the very beginning here. And the very beginning is the start of philosophy, so the start of marvel, as we are taught the source of philosophy consists in. So from the very start, philosophy teaches us to be wary of language, to not be seduced by its thaumaturgical powers, right? It teaches us to distance ourselves from the arcane powers of the falsely transparency of words. It teaches us to go for the hard and imperious route of analysis and synthesis that marks what has been called the strenuous toil of conceptual reflection, where this is, at least they tell me, the English translation of the Anstrengung des Begriffs. So that's Hegel's concept from the preface of the Phänomenologie des Geistes. With a little bit less of a German phrase, we can point it out with, I think, a beautiful way of phrasing it by the French poet Paul Valéry. He says that un mot est un gouffre sans fond. A word is like a bottomless pit. So keeping Valéry in mind, let us be careful not to deviate from this methodos, from this way. What I want to do is to take on the challenge of studying migration philosophically. Now, over the last decades, we've seen a quite exceptional renaissance when it comes to migration and citizenship-related literature and debate. But before attempting to reconstruct any opinions in this debate, I think it's necessary to recall that both citizenship and migration are first and foremost words. So This matters here because I think it's important to stress the difference we find between the ordinary language and the language of law. Well, I said difference, but perhaps I should tell the truth and say it's more like a chasm. It's more like an abyss. It's more like a rift. So we know that words mean very different things for the lawyer and for the client. And for our purposes here, it's important to distinguish the undeniable empirical dimension of, for instance, presence on territory from its normative cousins: residence, stay, sojourn, abode, dwelling, domicile, etc. So not to grasp the difference between these two dimensions would be to confuse fact and norm, to confuse the language of the law with its object of regulation. And this, we know, for a jurist, is a mortal sin. So legal thinking concerns what we today call institutional facts, and I think this is important to underline. So what do I mean by that? I mean facts where a function is attributed to something that doesn't have this function in virtue of its empirical properties. So it needs to have it in virtue of something else. Now, a common way in which facts like this arise is, of course, through constitutive rules. And from this perspective, we can say that law appears to be essentially status generative, we may call it. It creates, it constitutes different forms of statuses. Now, you might think of a status a little bit like a point in a board game. And this is something that I take from the Scandinavian legal realists. So I've long been interested in their work. And I think that one thing that is important about their work is that they understood very early on that legal thinking concerns a different kind of facts than ordinary empirical facts. So they understood that legal thinking operates with non-empirical facts, so facts of a different kind, that, however, may be empirically investigated. Okay. So if you think of it in this way, we can let me start with an image. So imagine that there's a rule according to which in certain contexts, something counts as a point in, say, a board game. So of course, it's not the nature of the thing itself, right, that makes it into a point, right? It's not the empirical features of the little object, right, that will turn it into a point. But rather, what will do so is the constitutive rule. Now, the outline that I just gave of how a point in a board game works is reminiscent of how many rules in law work. And I think this insight into the ontology of institutional facts play an important role for our understanding of legal concepts in general, but more specifically for our understanding of the central concepts that we're operating with in migration law. So grasping the consequences of this insight, I think, might be useful for a renewed discussion. And what I'll try to show is that the belief in our epistemic access to what counts as migration, what counts as citizenship, or what counts as population, say. Our belief in having this direct epistemic access to this concept might be actually an hindrance, an obstacle to our proper understanding. So in particular, I would like to show that the belief according to which we know what a citizen is or what a migrant is actually constitutes an object or an obstacle to our understanding. I want to show why the ordinary way in which migration studies casts its object of study is profoundly misleading. And I want to show why we need, as legal theorists, a philosophical turn in the study of migration. Okay, so you've probably been confronted with a situation like this, either because you had a bigger brother or smaller sister or something when you were a kid, or either because you have children of your own. Now, with very small children, it's always a little bit of a bother trying to explain what a point in a board game is. Okay, so small children will typically want to have something in exchange, right? They want a little pebble or a little sweet or a little coin or any denumerable object, right? Something they can hold in their hand or stick in their pockets, right? So children that are a little bit older or parents need to explain carefully here that, I mean, you might have an interest in having this point, even though you can't stick it into your pocket, you can't lick it, and you can't eat it, right? So this story about how the point in a board game goes, I think is important to remember how a status works, right? So a status is a concept of which we may offer an empirical explanation, but in itself, it is of course not an empirical concept, right? Philosophers say that we exercise our deontic power by creating various forms of statuses. If you think of it from that perspective, law appears to be a little bit like a technique or a technology that we employ in order to achieve a particular order in the world, right? It's something that we use to arrange the world as opposed to merely describing it. So to a certain extent, we can say that the law makes the world as it is, right? It orders the world by constituting and regulating various forms of statuses. Now, also, notice another point that is important. A status is, epistemologically speaking, it works like a vox media. So in itself, a status or a point in a board game are not true or false. It's an artifact of the human mind. It's neither good nor bad. However, it may become good or bad depending on how well or how poorly it performs its function within the ecology of other statuses and legal positions it stands in relationship to. So if one cannot show that the vox media allows a functional correlation between the premise and the conclusion in legal reasoning, the legal status may become an arbitrary tool for separating those who fall within the remit of it and those who fall beyond. So ill-conceived legal statuses that result in arbitrary line drawing suffer from a lack of justification that undermines their legitimacy. Not having acceptable and satisfactory criteria for distinguishing between, say, citizens and non-citizens make it very difficult to argue against proposals such as distributing passports by, say, flipping coins or drawing the short straw. Now, scholars, here's some examples, who have stressed the arbitrary nature of citizenship or the tyrannical form of domination that it would be grounded on, have understood this. I don't think that citizenship is by necessity arbitrary, but it necessarily becomes arbitrary or an arbitrary tool of distinguishing between insiders and outsiders if we cannot show that there are good reasons for distinguishing the one from the others, that are good ways or good reasons for designing the selection mechanism in that specific way, given the nature of the collectivity that we're facing. Saila bin Habib, for instance, speaks here of a fundamental right to justification. But notice that when it comes to citizenship, the justification often just doesn't come. We're often not given any form of justification. And there's a set of systemic reasons for this. First of all, it's a prerogative of sovereignty. You can think of the 1930 Hague Convention, Article 1, for instance. So the state basically enjoys a very wide discretion when it comes to the right to exclude. In EU law, to take another example, citizenship policy belongs to the domaine réservé. Typically, citizenship is regulated by ordinary law, not by constitutional law. and very often, when it's regulated in constitutional law, it is merely by lexical referencing back to ordinary law or even to lower ordinances within the system. So very few countries actually regulate citizenship at the constitutional level. More importantly, the choice of citizenship policy is very often made without considering the constitutional context within which it is inserted. Now notice that not only do we change citizenship policy regardless of the constitutional setting, but we also do this at an increasing pace. So over the last decade, the pace at which citizenship acts have been passed, modified, amended, etc., has been increasing. Let me give you the example of citizenship. Right. So how can we know who should be attributed the status? Well, I told you before that it's a vox media, right? You should think of the status as a form of vox media. And as a vox media, basically what it does is that it links criteria for acquisition and loss of the status, in this case it's status civitatis, with the various legal positions, so rights and obligations that are attributed to citizens, qua citizens, so attributed to citizens in virtue of they having the citizenship. Okay, now, precisely because of this, it doesn't make any sense to try to determine who should be a citizen regardless of the contents of citizenship, right? Regardless of the rights and obligations connected to the status, right? Why? Because it would be a little bit like trying to determine what is the just criteria for distribution without knowing what you're supposed to distribute. The ancients had a name for this. It's hysteron proteron. It's like putting the cart before the horse. But once we know which are the legal positions connected to the status, so the contents or the substance of citizenship, once we know what we're supposed to distribute, well, then we are in a position to say whether particular criteria of acquisition and loss of the status are apt, are consistent or inconsistent with those legal positions that you're supposed to distribute. Now, notice that since the legal positions will also vary according to the constitutional framework, I mean, of course, in democracies, citizens are attributed a role that don't have elsewhere, for instance. So the rights and duties of the citizens will be different from one country to the next. Now, given that this is the case, the goodness of the status can only be evaluated once the constitutional framework is determined. It is therefore a hopeless task to determine who should be a citizen in any political community, because at that level of abstraction, we just can't know. However, once we have determined at which is the particular constitutional setting we're looking at, or what is the particular political community we're analyzing, once we know that, then it becomes possible to pose this question. And we can say that the solution is that if the design of the status is to be consistent, and let me point out that there might be a host of political reasons for why lawmakers do not want to make the status consistent, but that is another matter. But if one wants the status to be consistent, then to whom citizenship is granted must depend on what citizenship consists in. Now, these insights into, on the one hand, as I gave you the example before with the points in the board game, this insight into the ontological nature of statuses on one hand, and on the other hand, what this implies when we try to evaluate normatively statuses, this is key for our understanding today. So here's how. Once we realize that statuses are not natural kinds, we are much better positioned to appreciate how law constitutes the statuses of things that in ordinary language are conceived to be entities of a natural kind. This includes things like citizenship, residence, habitual dwelling, migration, population, etc. Now, notice that none of these or as we find them in the law, actually refer to empirical facts. Rather, they refer to institutional facts that are determined by particular constitutive rules that are set up by the law. And they could have been different, so they're contingent. Why is this the case? Because the way the constitutive rule is set up is a question of convention. It's not a question of empirical necessity. So this means that the empirical characteristics may be used as a basis for activating a status. But that is just a different point. And to ignore the difference that I'm trying to underline here, so between the empirical characteristics on one hand and the institutional fact on the other, to ignore the difference, well, that is a mortal sin. So in my reading here, if my reading on the ontology of statuses as institutional facts is correct, it follows that we make a lot of assumptions about migration, population, people, and what have you, that might not be furthering a correct understanding. So contrarily to geographers, biologists, medical doctors, we don't study migration or population as a natural kind, even though, of course, human fluxes and demographics might be relevant for our understanding of the institutional facts of law, how we're supposed to understand them and how they're constituted. So it might be important for our understanding of the institutional facts. For example, political asylum, which refers to a legal status, right, has different meaning in the Cold War context and today. And this is clearly due to empirical features, such as the racialization of migration flows. Okay, so if my reading of the ontology of statuses as institutional facts is correct, it follows that migration law perhaps does not concern bodies moving in space. Perhaps migration law concerns the design and operation with statuses in the abstract space of legal computation. So in order to see this more clearly, I would suggest to introduce a distinction between mobility and migration. Okay, so the main reason why I want to make this distinction is because it is the law that we employ in order to decide who counts as a migrant, who counts as a citizen, respectively. Under which conditions this is so, for how long this is the case, and what is needed in order for this to change. We use the law in order to determine this. Nothing similar can be said about mobility. So by mobility here, I mean a movement of a body in space. That can occur across a border, but it's not necessary that it occurs across a border. Mobility is an empirical phenomenon. It takes place in the world. It is best investigated using empirical methods, of course. Now, mobility gives rise to lots of interesting normative questions, but those normative questions do not coincide and they're not identical to the normative issues raised by migration. Okay, so by migration here, I mean a change in a person's legal status vis-a-vis one or more states or vis-a-vis supranational organizations. The reason why I added supranational organizations is because it is possible to think of European citizenship as a form of citizenship. Now, migration concerns here the legal positions, so the rights and obligations that regulates the person's right to stay in a country, to be protected against deportation, to be reunited with family members, just to name one of, some of the few common rights that are associated with one's migration status. But it could be extended to many more because it might concern the individual's working life or the socio-economical life in general. So according to this definition, status civitatis, or citizenship, is a migration status. It's a status that concerns the position that a person has vis-a-vis one or several political communities. Now, notice that the distinction that I'm suggesting here is radically different from the way citizenship and migration studies typically think of their object of studies. Right, so if you open a textbook in migration law, you will find the canonical definition, and you will read that this is about movement of people across borders. And this is the standard definition employed in migration law. Now, I want to take a step away from this common understanding, and I want to advocate for a philosophical turn in migration theory. The reason for this is that I think that the ontological understanding of what a legal status is, as not being an empirical fact, is important for our understanding here. So if my insight is correct and the law constitutes the person's status as a migrant or as a citizen, well, then perhaps we should reconsider what we think we know about migration. Allow me a metaphor. Now, this is a metaphor I take from the Scandinavian legal realists. It's the metaphor of money. So the relationship between mobility and migration is similar to that between paper and money. There's paper that counts as money, but not all paper is money, and not all money is certainly paper, right? So we find mobility that counts as migration, but not all mobility does. Consider this. So indeed, law perceives a difference between a person who steps out of her home or her car in the morning, and the person on the other side here that is jumping the fence at the Spanish Melilla enclave. However, from the empirical naturalistic point of view, both are, of course, movements of bodies in space. Also, consider that migration is not necessarily founded or grounded in mobility. So sometimes the physical movement of people is legally relevant. That is, it's a reason for a changed migration status. But a migrant is not someone who has necessarily moved or crossed the border. You can stay at home, being perfectly static, and still become a migrant. It's important to understand that mobility, so the physical movement, may trigger a change in migration status, but it's not required for such a change to happen, which means that whatever migration is, it certainly isn't grounded in physical movement, because physical movement just is insufficient to explain migration. So from this point of view, we can say that migration might result from a variety of other things. Say, a change in personal status, so marriage, divorce, birth, adoption, etc. A change in the law. So for instance, now it's been very popular in European countries to introduce new grounds for loss or quasi-loss of citizenship pursuant to terrorism suspects, right? Usually this also extends to family members. Other cases include changes in the territorial validity of jurisdiction. So on the 20th of January this year, 66 million Brits became third country nationals because of such a change. Sometimes it happens merely by the automatism of the law because there's been passage of time after 5 years or after a particular date, etc. Now, also notice that a jurisdiction may have extraterritorial validity, and sometimes part of the territory can be declared invalid for certain purposes, for instance, for asylum applications. Finally, the scope of a jurisdiction is constantly debated. It's the very raison d'être of what we call conflict of laws in the setting of private international law. So when we talk about migration, we should be really careful not to confuse territory and jurisdiction. I would also like to mention, this is things that appeal to those who like the story of language, right? So etymology. I would like to point out that migration, in the sense of moving, traveling, wandering, etc., it's not migrare in Latin. In Latin, there's a different verb for that. It's called peregrinare. So one could object that, well, the etymological root that gives migratio in Latin also gives amebein in Greek, which means to change. But it would be wrong to assume that migration therefore refers to mobility or change in general. Instead, it has to do with a change in legal status. Indeed, for instance, that of some individuals, the Latini, who could become Roman citizens through the institute of jus migrandi. Jus migrandi has never been a right to free movement. It was the right to naturalize as a Roman citizen. And it was not until modern times that the Latin verb migrare began to describe movement in space. So we often think of migration as related to migratory birds, right? You've heard that story before, right? But it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that the term migration was used to describe movements of animals across large areas. Because the first occasion here in which the verb migrare was used in this new modern sense is from the 60s, 40s, and it was in relation to human beings, not at all to animals. So those who emigrated from the old world to the new world were indeed the first modern migrants. Never before had the verb migrare been employed to qualify a movement in this way. Nor could it have been in any other way, because in early modern times, we simply didn't know where the migratory birds actually went. So I'll give you one example. Dr. Johnson, just to name one, actually believed that the swallows would sleep under the lakes in winter. That's romantic, right? Now, the distinction between migration and mobility has a number of consequences. Let me name two. So it means that our discourses are lacking in clarity, and we might misconceive the object of inquiry. So first, as social scientists, we often fall prey to confusing the natural kind with institutional fact. We speak as if residence, sojourn, entrance, family membership, and the like were natural kinds, but they're not. So in other words, we speak as if we knew what we were speaking about, and that is a problem. So are we really sure that migration law regulates the position of bodies in space rather than say how far from certain institutional structure that a person is located, right? It's not the movement itself that displaces you from institutional structures. It's something about the institutional fact that makes this occur. This is something that Bertolt Brecht had noticed a long time ago. So the German poet in Reisen im Exil made the ironical remark that perhaps the most noble part of man is the passport. Okay, so in the contemporary migration debate, we're afflicted by this kind of pensée unique. We keep on speaking about the movement across borders. It's full of discussions about boundaries and borderlands and liminal spaces, frontiers and front lines and streams and channels and flows and fluxes. My God, it's an obsession about space. And this is a point that should advert the lawyer. Now, we know that jurisdictions that ultimately will determine who counts as a migrant, how, when, and where this is the case, well, they're legal constructs. They are not locations in space. Now, if law is an instrument, a technology we employ in order to determine statuses, then state migration agencies will find migrants once they set out to look for them. For instance, all things being, or other things being equal, if a visa is hard to get, then entry into the country is more likely to occur in an irregular way. So the stock of irregular migrants will in part depend on visa policy. This is something that migration scholars have been noticing for a while, and this is why some think that so-called illegal migration is actually phantom ill. It's the product of the laws that fight it, basically. Think of it a little bit like fighting your own fist. Now, of course, for instance, Ruvi Zeigler, let me just quote one migration scholar here, asks, for instance, what kind of visa should you apply for in order to enter Britain if you are, say, a gay Iranian sentenced to death, or if you're a young Eritrean forced to indefinite military service, or if you're a Pakistani Christian couple convicted of blasphemy? Well, there are no such visas. So if this is right, then migration crisis might be to a certain extent policy made or fabricated, but for a much deeper reason than the reason that we typically find in the literature. So some people have stressed this, like Thomas Spiekerbø, for instance. He claims that we're facing a form of fabricated emergency because of suboptimal internal policy choices and because of external forces and events. But mobility, per se, doesn't create any migration crisis, simply because the law is not what, the law is what displaces people from institutional structures. It's not mobility that displaces people. So to see this, I think we need to understand that migration is not the same thing as mobility. Mobility is an empirical fact, migration is not. Migration is an institutional fact. And like the Scandinavian realists used to say, well, it's a little bit like magic. Okay, now what I've just said is the ground for me making my central claim here. Migration and citizenship laws enable something that I call population design. Now, often when we say population, we're unclear about what we mean. Are we meaning the natural kind, so the mere demographical instance, a set of human bodies, or are we meaning the legal construct, so the outcome of census, the object of policy design? Of course, population may indicate, on the one hand, the empirical fact, a set of living bodies within a given space and time, right? We can call that population one. But it might also indicate all natural persons recognized as such within a given jurisdiction, which is an institutional fact. Let's call it population two. Let me just add this point. The reason why I say recognized as such, it's not because it's redundant, it's because not all those who have the empirical requirements to be persons or natural persons are always recognized as such. So for instance, according to the Council of Europe's Marty report on the complicity of European states in the CIA's extraterritorial rendition during the War on Terror between 2001 and 2013, when the CIA charter flights carrying detainees arrived at certain European airports, the US staff underwent border control, but the detainees were classified as luggage. Now, what I'm saying about population here is also true for people, the constitutional bedrock. So by people, we may mean alpha, all the quasi-social citizens within a given social context. Let me just stress here that this very bizarre definition depends on the fact that here the word citizens appears in the meaning attributed to the term by T.H. Marshall, so a sociologist, for who citizenship is social integration. That's why I needed to add social in this context, because for lawyers, it's not obvious that what we would mean by social citizens. But now you know what I mean, it's socially integrated. The reason why I add quasi is because no one is ever fully socially integrated, because everyone would be at a certain point a child, an old person, a sick person, and probably you would also run through stages of crisis such as, I don't know, divorce, unemployment, you name it. Okay, so therefore nobody is ever fully integrated. We can just be so at certain stages, right? Now, this way of speaking of the people is a sociological fact, it's an empirical fact. But then we also have beta, people as all political citizens or a member of the polity within a given constitutional setting. And this is not a sociological fact. This is, Hans Kelsen's definition of the people or the citizenry. It's an institutional fact. Now, let me stress that the ambiguity between alpha and beta is as old as philosophy itself. Demos in Greek, in the singular, has two meanings. It is used to indicate the set of citizens in a polis. So in classical Athens, demos indicates all free and native-born adult males in Athens. But sometimes demos, and this is context-dependent, means instead a particular section of that citizenry, the peasants, the sailors, the manual laborers, okay? So what is called the common people. And this explains why Aristotle, for instance, claims that democracy is not the government of the many, but the government of the poor. Of course, he was using a word that has two meanings. Now, migration policy impacts on the determination of the members of the population in the institutional sense. And therefore, more often than not, it will also impact on the constitutional foundations of the state, namely people in the sense of beta, who gets to share power. But also, it will impact on the social composition of society. So it will impact on people in the sense of alpha, those you live with. So precisely because migration policy impacts both on alpha and on beta, we should be really cautious and very careful in observing the technicalities surrounding migration law. I argue that migration law should be of interest to constitutionalists, democratic theorists, and political philosophers much more than it is currently the case. So the policy area of migration and citizenship determines the extension and the social composition of the population in a given political community. So these are areas of law that contribute to constructing the position that any individual will come to occupy vis-a-vis the other individuals and vis-a-vis the collective action, namely the state action. These are areas of law that will shape a person's sociological role and help to determine people in the sense also of alpha. Now, since migration law typically governs access to residence rights, and residence rights typically are prerequisites for naturalization. And naturalization in many constitutional frameworks is what is required for political rights. It is the case that migration law, in combination with citizenship policy and electoral laws, determine who counts as the people in the sense of B. So how we regulate these matters will have a political impact on our constitutional identity. In turn, I think it's important to see that the composition of the institutional fact of the people, beta, or the set of citizens, its role in the constitutional order, so what the citizens do and what duties they have, what rights they have, this ultimately determines the state's constitutional identity. So precisely because legal statuses are institutional facts and not natural kinds, we can change our population in the institutional sense, the number and social identity of the individuals that we treat as migrants or as citizens. We can do that by the magic of pen strokes. Now, consequences. Classical ways of engaging in population design has included fabricating citizens or exporting the poor or otherwise unwanted of the community. So throughout history, the volume and composition of the population has sometimes been cast as a source. So one would want to have a lot of population, for instance. Usually it's connected to military reasons. But during the course of history, citizenship policy has also been used for other motives, drafting men to armies, avoiding responsibility for certain socio-economical groups, getting rid of more or less challenging minorities, you name it. Think of it as eugenetics by passport distribution. Now, popular tricks of population design include things like increasing the state's population fictively in order to gain power. This is an eternal temptation of electoral district engineers. Also, suggesting winning the battle for brains by opening the ranks of the citizenry or cherry-picking your preferred elites by fast-tracking it on the migration route. You can also intervene in other countries through your diaspora or imposing protection on your citizens abroad, like Russia did, for instance, in Georgia. You can meddle with other people's foreign policy. You can also incentivize migration to solve unemployment. This is a practice that has been much embraced both in Italy and the Philippines. You can also use it in order to export your poor. This is a temptation that the Gulf states have been looking into in order to avoid taking responsibility for guest workers in the region. Now, I think it's important to see that what is going on here is a form also of manipulating the political distribution of power in society. So rules concerning citizenship can be used for purposes of shifting power from one group to another. This is something that was known already to Gorgias from Lentini, the pre-Socratic sophist. He used to joke about the fact that states bow to the pleasure of fabricating citizens out of thin air. It's been 2,500 years, but we're still giggling at the joke. So citizenship policy might be used to shift power. I will give you this example and then I will wrap up my talk. A contemporary example of this shift in power is what is going on currently in the region of Assam in India. So the state claims to suffer a migration crisis due to the uncontrolled entrance and stay of Bangladeshi unauthorized migrants. Now, instead of, for instance, finding and prosecuting individuals that the state believes to be illegal migrants, that it wants to deport then to Bangladesh, Assam has chosen to require that its residents, many of whom are illiterate, prove that they are indeed citizens. Now, this implies a shift in the burden of proof, as you will all understand, from the state to the individual. Those who fail to prove their citizenship are placed in custody in view of deportation. Now, technically, the case of Assam is a so-called quasi-loss of citizenship. The validity of the status is declared void ex tunc. Now, there's very little evidence to suggest that these people would be anything else than Indians, but there's very much evidence to suggest that most of them, or overwhelmingly, are Muslim. Now, this fact exacerbates the political tensions in the region because in Assam, the dividing lines of politics mimic those between religious identities. So you have a Hindu party and a Muslim party, right? Now, the party system that reflects the social identities is, of course, impacted by this new policy. So the many Muslims are denationalized, the electoral composition or the composition of the electorate is changing, and the political party system is impacted. So basically, this is nothing short of manipulation of the constitutional identity. And I think that the case of Assam shows very well how a procedural technicality in the boring area of migration law can impact the political system. Now, the effect of this manipulation distorts the constitutional settlements, and by doing so, denigrates the value of citizenship also for the citizens who were not deprived of their citizenship, who were not deported. Why? Because it mocks the very sense of having a democratic regime when it's possible to use population design in order to erase your political enemy. Now, one thing that I think is important is that the case of Assam points to the fact that how you design migration statuses will reflect on who you are. It's important to notice that this is true even when the policy choices are wise, well justified, and morally good. Because it is true, independently and regardless of which policy choice is made, because it is so by necessity. So it's important to see that both who you admit and who you don't admit will reflect on who you will be tomorrow. So the constitutional identity of the state is therefore determined inter alios of the choice you make in these policy areas. You should therefore look very carefully at the lawmaking when it comes to the design of migration statuses, especially how they affect other legal positions within the system. Why? Because it's a status that works like a bundle of rights. It will affect all sorts of rights the person has within the system. The workplace, the social economical life, family life, and the political realm. Right? This is why it is such a delicate matter. Now, let me end by going back to the source. Let me recall Homer. Now, in Greece, as throughout the whole Mediterranean world, there was one law that one could not break, lest one would be reduced to an animal, a beast, and lose one's humanity. This was a moral law. We could call it a form of mores of humanity. This is the law of xenia that orders to give wine and food to the stranger, xenos, who is at the same time the guest and a foreigner. Now you are to offer shelter and share the table and never ask who the xenos is, nor where he is going. And only beasts ignore the law of xenia. Now remember Odysseus, right? He spends a year crossing the sea, and mostly he's pretty well nurtured in virtue of the law of xenia. Remember, for instance, the island of Scheria, where he meets the princess Nausicaa. Under the counsels of Athena, goddess of wisdom, he is offered hospitality, of course, and a great banquet. Perhaps you'll remember that at that banquet, Odysseus cries. But he cries of nostalgic pleasure, remembering the war of Troy. Certainly, he is not crying because he's badly treated. Quite the opposite. He's extremely well treated. So in the Odyssey, there is only one who really ignores the law of xenia, actually, who represents its nemesis, and it is Polyphemus. Now, not only doesn't he offer his guests to eat and to drink, he actually eats them up, right? He is the ultimate violation of the human duty to host the stranger. But unsurprisingly, Polyphemus is a monstrous brute. Now, do we want to model our lawmaking on Nausicaa, or do we prefer to imitate the blinded man-eating giant? Well, that, of course, depends on our inclinations. But no matter where you stand on this important point, a choice needs to be made. So in that sense, we do stand before a crisis in the etymological sense of a moment of choice. By not choosing, you run a different kind of risk. Because you can't, with one hand, recognize the principles of human rights, of constitutionalism, and with the other hand, create or craft migration statuses that are in breach of these principles. Because this kind of instability brings havoc. Now remember that in the Iliad, there is one man who attempts to have the cake and eat it, right? The one who possesses that he is a real man and that he knows the law of xenia. But as the night falls, he sneaks into the house of Menelaus, enters his bedroom, and seduces Helena. And wasn't it Paris who broke the law of xenia? And wasn't it Paris who first started the war of Troy? Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Patricia, por la excelente presentación. Ahora le damos la palabra a Natalia Castro, quien va a iniciar su contraponencia. Nati.
Muchísimas gracias, Vicky. Bueno, quiero iniciar, por supuesto, esta presentación agradeciendo nuevamente a la Cátedra de Cultura Jurídica, a los organizadores de este evento maravilloso. decir que, como dijo Vicky, esa cátedra fue mi casa en un año duro, pero hermoso de mi vida, que recuerdo con mucho cariño y que extraño también el espacio en el que estaba hace apenas, no sé, 4 años tal vez. Entonces quiero agradecer, por supuesto, a Jordi Ferrer, a Carmen Vázquez, también por la organización de este evento, a Victoria por haber pensado en mí para este panel, a pesar de que mi especialidad no sea, por supuesto, el derecho de las migraciones, y que en teoría no haga teoría, parece que en la práctica sí la hago, así que, bueno, ya veremos cómo va esto. Quiero agradecer también muy especialmente a Patricia por haberme facilitado el borrador de su ponencia y el borrador del capítulo que guardo secretamente, nadie lo ha visto, pero que desde ya los invito a leer cuando sea publicado, porque contiene unas reflexiones muy interesantes que fueron presentadas aquí esta mañana ya por Patricia, y unas un poco más profundas que creo que vale la pena también que todos lean. Así que el objetivo de esta intervención va a ser poner la luz sobre algunos de los aspectos que ha tratado y que ha desarrollado Patricia esta mañana, y mostrarles de alguna forma cuáles pueden ser otras implicaciones adicionales al esquema o al modelo que plantea de lectura ontológica del fenómeno de la migración Patricia en este trabajo. Así las cosas, entonces voy a dividir esta presentación en 3 puntos. Primero voy a hablar un poco como punto de partida de algunos de los aspectos centrales de la presentación de Patricia, y de antemano me disculpo si las traducciones de pronto no son exactas de los términos que ella utilizó. Después de eso me gustaría abordar una inquietud que tengo que está relacionada con un punto particular de la presentación que está más desarrollada en el capítulo, así que sin dar más, sin develar el contenido del capítulo, quisiera dar la oportunidad también a Patricia de que cuando vuelva a intervenir nos cuente un poco más sobre esto. Y por último, quisiera referirme a una aplicación que me parece interesante de esta lectura que ella hace en relación con el derecho internacional público. Entonces, como punto de partida de la presentación, quisiera resaltar un poco el modelo subyacente a la presentación de Patricia, que es este modelo derivado o inspirado en el realismo jurídico escandinavo, que parte de la distinción entre estos hechos empíricos o categorías naturales que por la fuerza de normas constitutivas, es decir, de normas que crean estatus, estas normas del juego que crean por convención unos resultados, crean unos hechos institucionales, en el caso de la migración, pero por supuesto en muchas otras materias, esos hechos institucionales están dados por estatus, a los que ella hacía referencia, relacionados con posiciones jurídicas, es decir, con conjuntos de derechos y obligaciones atribuidos a sujetos. Entonces, en ese esquema, que va entonces del hecho empírico a la norma constitutiva, al hecho institucional, un elemento esencial que ella resalta tiene que ver, por supuesto, con la necesidad de justificar cómo se pasa de cada uno de estos pasos al otro, ¿no? Cada una de estas etapas. Esa necesidad de justificar es muy importante para legitimar justamente la forma en la que se crean las categorías, y está relacionada, entonces, digamos, con una legitimación que no es puramente interna, no tiene que ver solamente con las categorías, sino por supuesto con otros valores que pueden ser jurídicos, pueden estar en otras normas o pueden ser extrajurídicos, por supuesto. Digamos, ese contexto, esos valores o esas finalidades que se busca alcanzar con ese paso del hecho empírico al hecho institucional es uno de los puntos más interesantes, creo, que pone en evidencia la lectura que hace Patricia, porque nos muestra finalmente que la realidad que creemos ver es en realidad una creación, y esa creación tiene una finalidad, ¿sí? Ella nos dice que la finalidad en general de esta técnica pues es la finalidad del derecho, es decir, regular el mundo, organizarlo de alguna manera. El derecho es una herramienta para lograr ese propósito, y en relación con los temas migratorios eso es bastante evidente, pero no siempre, digamos, aparece como debería en el análisis de estos fenómenos. Entonces, esa lectura ya, como vimos, la aplica entonces al discurso sobre migración, y eso tiene 2 consecuencias. La primera por la que ella inicia, que es justamente el llamado de atención a no confundir los hechos empíricos relacionados con la movilidad con los hechos institucionales relacionados con la migración, y aplicar esa distinción en el análisis de todas las categorías y de todos los estatus creados en esta familia de conceptos relacionada con el derecho migratorio, que se deriva del derecho migratorio. Para mostrarnos cómo, pues finalmente de lo que estamos hablando es de una cuestión de diseño. Es decir, cómo se diseñan estas normas está guiado por una finalidad y a veces eso queda como escondido detrás de lo que vemos y justamente el llamado es a percibir el fenómeno completo. Esa primera consecuencia me parece sumamente importante. La segunda consecuencia, que me parece aún más interesante, tiene que ver con la consecuencia que tiene ese diseño de población, entonces, o más bien, sí, este diseño de cómo se lee la población en relación con el sistema democrático y constitucional de los estados. Porque justamente el derecho migratorio es entonces una herramienta que permite diseñar la población, o más bien el pueblo, que desde ese punto de vista es un hecho institucional, es decir, es un producto de las normas, pero no es un hecho institucional cualquiera. El pueblo es nada más ni nada menos que un elemento constitutivo esencial del Estado, pero además, bajo la teoría política, digamos, la teoría de la democracia, pues es el fundamento último de las decisiones del Estado, es decir, no es cualquier hecho institucional. De ahí la importancia de esta lectura compleja del derecho migratorio. Ahora, ella llama entonces la atención sobre cómo estas reglas que determinan el derecho migratorio inciden en la configuración del pueblo o en lo que entendemos por pueblo. Pero más allá de eso, y este es el punto como es más interesante, pues esas reglas tienen un efecto determinante en la distribución del poder dentro de una comunidad política. Entonces, si uno mira el fenómeno de atrás hacia adelante, pues lo que encuentra es que hay una finalidad de distribución de poder dentro de la comunidad política y finalmente las reglas, las normas constitutivas son un instrumento para lograrlo, ¿sí? Y ese instrumento se aplica creando estatus, categorías que no deben ser leídas justamente como hechos empíricos porque son producto de una creación normativa. Ese punto entonces me parece sin duda de dudas como la idea más provocadora de este trabajo. Y es justamente el punto sobre el que me gustaría que profundizáramos un poco. En particular, un punto que ella desarrolla en la presentación, pero que como les digo, está un poco mejor, está más desarrollado, más a profundidad en el borrador del capítulo, así que voy aquí, cumplo la función de incitarlos a leerlo una vez se ha publicado, tiene que ver con las diferentes acepciones del pueblo. Y ella en su trabajo habla de cómo el pueblo puede ser leído con base en el origen griego del término como una parte del pueblo o como el pueblo como un todo. Y esa distinción entre el pueblo como parte del pueblo y el pueblo como un todo, no voy a entrar en el detalle de explicarlo porque me parece que eso le corresponde a Patricia, pero tiene un efecto muy interesante porque digamos que crea una segunda forma de exclusión en la distribución del poder político que es posterior a la exclusión que se opera con fundamento en la categoría de ciudadano. Es decir, cuando una persona no es ciudadano, ¿cierto? Queda de facto excluido de la comunidad política. Pero aún si es ciudadano y hace parte de la comunidad política, puede que las decisiones o la distribución del poder se opere de tal forma que las decisiones en esa comunidad política no sean tomadas con fundamento en los intereses de esa persona. ¿Por qué? Porque las decisiones dentro de las comunidades políticas a veces no reflejan el interés del pueblo como un todo, sino de una parte del pueblo. Y ella hace referencia a este fenómeno en relación particularmente con el populismo y con los momentos, digamos, del poder, los momentos de ejercicio del poder constituyente. Sin embargo, como todos sabemos, pues no se requiere ni estar necesariamente en el momento del poder constitutivo, la constitución del Estado, ni en una sociedad puramente populista para ver cómo las decisiones dentro de una comunidad política reflejan los intereses de una parte del pueblo y no de todo el pueblo, o más bien una parte del pueblo pretende ser todo el pueblo a efectos de que se justifiquen o se tomen determinadas decisiones en la comunidad política por la forma en la que se distribuye el poder dentro de esa comunidad política. Entonces, me parece interesante este punto, la razón por la cual me gustaría que profundizara sobre esa distinción, tiene que ver con que si uno le aplica a esa distinción entre las formas de pueblo, la distinción previa entre hecho empírico y hecho institucional, La pregunta sería, si solamente hay un hecho empírico y un hecho institucional, es decir, si cada una de esas categorías, pueblo como parte y pueblo como todo, corresponden la primera a hecho empírico y la segunda a hecho institucional, o si uno podría leer formas de hecho institucional y de hecho empírico en los dos casos. Sé que lo estoy haciendo parecer mucho más complejo, pero en realidad la riqueza de esas distinciones tiene que ver con que nos apuntan, nos muestran un poco la dirección hacia la existencia de normas constitutivas que regulan, como les decía, una segunda forma de exclusión en la distribución del poder. La de aquellos ciudadanos que no fueron objeto de la primera exclusión porque son ciudadanos, pero que sin embargo tampoco se ven atribuido una cuota de poder dentro de la distribución que operan esas normas constitutivas. Y esa es la razón por la cual me gustaría de pronto que Patricia nos contara un poco sobre ese punto en particular, que no tiene necesariamente que ver con el derecho migratorio, pero sí con la forma en la que se configuran las posiciones jurídicas de acuerdo con las normas constitucionales o seguramente otra forma de normas al interior del Estado. Eso, por supuesto, en relación con lo que ella decía al final, en relación con la decadencia de la democracia y la crisis de legitimidad que generan las exclusiones de las comunidades políticas cuando se van a tomar decisiones. Entonces, ese es como el segundo punto sobre el que me gustaría que ella nos contara un poco más, porque además creo que tiene una vigencia increíble en relación con los sistemas populistas y todas las discusiones que hay en términos de populismo, migración, democracia, legitimidad. Creo que tiene una vigencia increíble este tema y la lectura particularmente que ella hace. Eso entonces en cuanto a esas dos primeras cuestiones, el punto de partida, las consecuencias que creo que son más interesantes del trabajo y la cuestión que creo que vale la pena profundizar para tener un panorama más completo de cómo funcionan estas normas constitutivas en materia de migración. Ahora, la última parte de esta intervención, en la última parte me gustaría hacer un ejercicio un poco más osado, que tiene que ver con aplicar ese modelo que ella crea al derecho internacional público en general. ¿Por qué? Pues porque primero este es el panel de teoría del derecho internacional, eso me pareció un ejercicio interesante, y segundo porque, claro, el derecho de las migraciones, uno podría decir, bueno, tiene un componente internacional, por supuesto, pero es un derecho interno finalmente. De hecho, yo diría que es un derecho rabiosamente interno, es decir, los estados reivindican el ejercicio del derecho migratorio como una de las potestades que se deriva de forma más directa de su propia soberanía, ¿sí? Y es por ello justamente que Patricia hacía la aclaración en relación con que uno también podría hablar de cómo le ejerce una organización supranacional o una organización internacional con la Unión Europea. Pero fíjense que justamente eso toca fibras sensibles porque implica hablar de la soberanía de la Unión y de la forma en la que se constituye como organización política, crea una comunidad política y en ese sentido se puede hablar de ciudadanos de la Unión. Ese debate, a pesar de que en Europa parece haber sido como no dejado de lado, pero al menos, digamos, hoy en día es menos polémico, sigue siendo un debate complicado porque tiene que ver con en quién radica la soberanía. Pero bueno, se trata entonces de un tema finalmente de derecho interno, o bien del Estado o bien de la organización internacional. Pero si uno mira entonces, digamos, con el lente del derecho internacional y se pregunta, ya no por la comunidad política del Estado, sino por la comunidad política internacional, tratando de hacer un ejercicio de abstracción de qué significa, cuál sería ese derecho migratorio o qué es la ciudadanía internacional, si es que eso existe, aplicando el modelo que les decía que subyace en el paper de Patricia, que es este de pasar del hecho empírico por que una norma lo convierte en hecho institucional y el efecto que eso tiene en la conformación de la comunidad política. Pues tal vez para aplicarlo al derecho internacional, lo más sencillo sería, y me disculpo si esto no es lo más ortodoxo, empezar por el final, es decir, ¿cuál es la comunidad política del derecho internacional? Y en derecho internacional, digamos, sobre esto hay muchísimos debates. Entonces, para algunos es claro que se trata de una comunidad de estados, para otros es la sociedad internacional, para otros una comunidad internacional concebida como un todo cosmopolita, ¿cierto? En todo caso, digamos, sobre lo que podemos estar de acuerdo, aplicando esa misma lectura que hace Patricia en relación con la migración, pues todas esas formas de comunidad política no son hechos empíricos, son por supuesto hechos institucionales, son producto de unas normas, es decir, depende de la norma que uno aplique, la comunidad será más amplia o menos amplia y por supuesto, digamos, quienes la integran estará determinado por esas mismas normas. Entonces, el interés de aplicar esta lectura es que nos lleva a pensar, bueno, entonces, ¿cuáles son las normas que determinan en derecho internacional quiénes hacen parte de la comunidad política? Y una primera respuesta, digamos, muy evidente parecería ser pues, que se trata de las normas sobre quiénes son sujetos en el derecho internacional, es decir, las normas que regulan el estatus civitatis del derecho internacional, que es la personalidad jurídica internacional. ¿Sí? Estas normas son normas consuetudinarias, ¿cierto? A diferencia del derecho migratorio, no tienen, digamos, un estatus preciso dentro del ordenamiento jurídico internacional, son normas consuetudinarias, son normas imprecisas, digamos, históricamente la certeza ha sido siempre que es el Estado la primera persona jurídica de derecho internacional, luego empezamos a hablar de la personalidad jurídica de las organizaciones, y uno diría, bueno, con esto ya tenemos al menos claro que la distribución de poder dentro de la comunidad internacional se efectúa por partes iguales entre estados. Todos tienen derechos políticos, pero en la realidad no es así. Históricamente ha existido otros estatus, que uno podría relacionar con algunos grados inferiores de ciudadanía en el derecho interno, en los cuales los estados, a pesar de ser sujetos, no han logrado, digamos, ejercer con plenitud sus derechos de participación política. Piensen ustedes en categorías como las naciones civilizadas, los estados bajo tutela, todas las categorías propias de la dominación colonial, o el primer y el tercer mundo, hoy en día el norte y el sur global. Lo interesante de la lectura es ver que estas categorías que tienen que ver con eso, quienes hacen parte de la comunidad política, pues no son hechos de la naturaleza. Es decir, son creadas con un propósito particular relacionado con la distribución de poder. Esa es su función. Hoy en día incluso uno puede ir más allá, porque hay quienes reclaman la extensión del concepto de comunidad para incluir otros sujetos distintos de los puramente estatales, como por ejemplo las personas, los individuos, la persona humana. Allí, digamos, el debate hoy en día parece un poco, digamos, superado. Sin embargo, hay quienes aún consideran que el individuo no debe ser considerado sujeto de derecho internacional. Y en cuanto a ese debate, digamos, hay buenas razones de un lado y del otro, pero en donde el debate es realmente mucho más complicado, tiene que ver con las personas jurídicas. Entonces, personas jurídicas sin ánimo de lucro, las ONGs, por ejemplo, ¿qué grado de personalidad jurídica tienen? Y en ese sentido, con la lectura de Patricia, ¿qué cuota de poder les corresponde en la decisión, en las decisiones en la comunidad internacional o en esta comunidad política del derecho internacional? Las personas jurídicas con ánimo de lucro. Y allí, digamos, el debate sí es de los más acalorados, porque pues tiene que ver con las empresas transnacionales y qué tantos derechos y obligaciones tienen. Y aquí, contrario a lo que sucede con el derecho migratorio, la intención de todos estos candidatos a sujeto no es la de convertirse en sujeto. Justamente, por ejemplo, una de las luchas de las empresas transnacionales es no convertirse en sujeto para no verse atribuir obligaciones, quedarse con algún tipo de beneficio que puede o no ser leído como derecho, pero sin ser sujeto para no verse atribuido obligaciones, por ejemplo, en materia de derechos humanos, de protección ambiental, hay un sinnúmero de temas allí. Y el de otras categorías, sujetos más indeterminados, no sé, los pueblos indígenas, y en esos casos, digamos que el derecho internacional está como en una zona un poco gris, que se deriva del hecho de que el estatus como tal no está definido en forma precisa, porque las normas consuetudinarias, a diferencia de lo que sucede con el estatus migratorio, pues no tienen esa naturaleza. Entonces, bueno, como les digo, entonces el interés del modelo para el derecho internacional es muy amplio, nos hace pensar en muchas cuestiones. Y en particular, digamos, muestra, como les decía, que estas categorías de las que he venido hablando, contrario a lo que uno podría pensar, pues no son naturales, sino que han sido creadas por normas. Y justamente como lo decía Patricia en relación con la migración, la distinción nos permite llamar la atención sobre cuál es la finalidad de esas normas, es decir, por qué han sido creadas y cómo se justifica la existencia de esas normas, es decir, con relación a qué valores o a qué principios internos o externos. Porque, como les decía, si no hay claridad sobre las normas, pues mucho menos hay claridad sobre cuál es la justificación detrás de la distribución de poder que terminan operando este tipo de normas en el derecho internacional. Además de eso, un punto que tocó Patricia al inicio es que el hecho de considerar, de considerar o de poner de relieve que un hecho es un hecho natural tiene que ver con la posibilidad de lo que ella llama el acceso epistémico a ese hecho, es decir, la posibilidad de estudiarlo como un hecho de la naturaleza, ¿sí? La pregunta aquí es, bueno, si la comunidad internacional y todas las categorías de las que acabo de hablar son hechos institucionales, ¿cuáles son los hechos empíricos a los cuales responden esas categorías? Y sobre eso, pareciera que no hay mucha información tampoco. Es decir, ¿quién es el demos en el sentido, o quién es la población internacional? ¿Existe alguna posibilidad de acceso epistémico a eso? Y la verdad, esto no tengo una respuesta al respecto, me parece bastante complicado, porque justamente estamos en una sociedad en la que podremos terminar englobando una cantidad de sujetos, de actores y entidades muy distintas, ¿sí? Producto muchas de ellas incluso de otras normas, y bueno, digamos, es un círculo vicioso de alguna manera, pero el interés de aplicar esa distinción es justamente ver, bueno, ¿y quiénes son estas personas entonces, o quiénes son estos sujetos llamados a conformar esta comunidad política? El segundo punto de interés tiene que ver, como les decía, con el hecho de que las normas que generan la exclusión de lo que sería el status civitatis en derecho internacional, pues no son claras. Es decir, son normas consuetudinarias y eso de por sí, digamos, ya genera un problema, porque pues no son normas formuladas por escrito, o cuando han sido formuladas son normas parciales. Si hay lagunas o zonas grises en el derecho migratorio, ahora imagínense lo que sería un derecho migratorio internacional, es decir, eso más difícil aún. ¿Qué derechos tienen, qué obligaciones, quién es sujeto y quién no? Interrogante total. Pero además piensen que se trata de normas hechas por los mismos destinatarios de las normas. Las normas que crean categorías como, o que las que les dan efectos, por ejemplo, a categorías como el norte o el sur global, los países en desarrollo, los países menos avanzados, todas esas normas que en derecho internacional regulan ese tipo de categorías y les atribuyen derechos y obligaciones a ese conjunto de estados, son creadas por los mismos estados. Y eso creo que crea una dificultad adicional. No se les imponen, sino que ellos mismos se las imponen. Y, como les decía, la justificación para generar esa exclusión, pues no es clara. Y gran parte, yo creo, del problema de la legitimidad del derecho internacional tiene que ver con eso. Es decir, ¿por qué razones se excluyen algunos de los sujetos de ese círculo de tomadores de decisiones que es la comunidad política internacional? ¿Cuáles son los motivos detrás de esa exclusión? En derecho internacional, por ejemplo, uno no podría hablar de que la regla que fundamenta la idea de que el demos es quien toma las decisiones es la democracia. Claramente estamos lejos de eso, pero por lo menos debería haber alguna justificación que nos permita entender por qué se crean esas categorías y cuál es su función al interior del ordenamiento jurídico internacional. Aún más cuando los excluidos son tantos, es decir, como en un estado en el que hay una cantidad de migrantes increíbles que no puede acceder al estatus migratorio o a la naturalización, por ejemplo, pues en el derecho internacional la mayoría de quienes nos vemos aplicar las normas internacionales, y eso incluye a todas las personas de derecho interno también, pues no participamos de esos procesos de toma de decisiones. ¿Y cuál es el fundamento de esa exclusión si finalmente son normas que regulan cada vez de forma más directa lo que sucede al interior de los estados? Y allí la reflexión es un poco, el derecho migratorio, por supuesto, concede unos poderes, derechos y obligaciones increíbles a los ciudadanos, pero el poder que puede distribuir el Estado es cada vez menor, porque finalmente cada vez hay más restricciones sobre el ejercicio de esos poderes que vienen del derecho internacional. Entonces, esas otras restricciones, ¿quién las decide y por qué las decide? Y eso directamente conectado con la segunda parte de la intervención y el punto relacionado con la diferencia entre el pueblo como un todo y el pueblo como parte. Porque justamente este sí que es un escenario en el que solamente una parte del pueblo, sea quien sea, habla en nombre de todo el pueblo. Y probablemente esa parte del pueblo, fíjense, ni siquiera tiene la categoría de sujeto. Cuando uno piensa, por ejemplo, en la influencia de empresas transnacionales o de otros grupos de interés, incluso ONGs de otro tipo, en la creación de normas internacionales y la forma como se diseñan los mecanismos jurídicos internacionales, económicos, ambientales, de todo tipo, y piensa que ni siquiera son sujetos de derecho internacional, es decir, que técnicamente ni siquiera hacen parte de la comunidad política internacional, pues como las preguntas son aún mayores. Y eso, pues simplemente piensen ustedes en el tema de hoy en día, de las vacunas, del COVID, del cambio climático, es decir, tantos aspectos en los cuales las decisiones nos afectan absolutamente a todos y no sabemos ni siquiera quién las está tomando y cuál es la razón por la cual todos los demás nos vemos excluidos de esa comunidad política, y a qué fin sirve esa exclusión. Con esto entonces cerraría la intervención, diciéndoles finalmente que lo que intenté mostrar ahora en esta última parte de la intervención es todas las posibilidades de aplicación y los desafíos que abre en la interpretación y la lectura de este tipo de fenómenos, el planteamiento que hace Patricia en su trabajo, cuando, digamos, nos pensamos cuestiones distintas a las puramente constitucionales del Estado y nos dedicamos a pensar las cuestiones que podríamos llamar constitucionales internacionales. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Natalia. Patricia, si quieres contestarle.
Thank you. I'll be answering in English because otherwise we would have to find. Right. So I think that you're perfectly right in pointing out that the key aspect that deserves greater analysis and that we should really be attracting our attention to is the question of how do we justify the creation of the constitutive rules. That is the real deal, right? And clearly, I mean, this opens the whole box of what counts as arbitrary lawmaking, what counts as, etc., what counts as bad lawmaking, right? And can there be, this is, you know, the old problem that we've been, the vexata question really for all philosophers of law. Can there be lawmaking that is so bad that it barely qualifies as lawmaking? Right. Well, that's tricky. That depends on your overall commitments in philosophy of law, I think, right? But for sure, it is the case that we would need a greater level of justification. And I want to attract the attention to one point. It is also up to us as participants in this linguistic game that we play around the law to make sure that we obtain from lawmakers a justification. And I find that, for instance, when it comes to the debate on migration, it is amazing that we keep on revising the laws on citizenship, right, without ever having a serious debate about what is the impact on the constitutional setting. That is a question that simply isn't raised. So, I mean, a lot of things can be done in terms of requiring a better justification for how the reforms are being made, and perhaps, requiring the justifications to be, better grounded in law. But of course, if one views, and I think this is part of the reason why I wanted to do this, if one views migration law as a question of actually regulating the placement of human bodies, if you view it that way, okay, then you're inclined to think that this matter is, why not, properly located when the street-level bureaucracy, gray corridors of the state administration, right? And it is this view that what we're doing is that we're controlling the borders, right? This view is associated with the state discretion, right? So I think it's important to demystify and to show that when we're engaging in this, you pointed out correctly, internal migration policy, what we're actually doing is that we're attributing positions of power, and including rights and obligations, of course, to different members that we are already having a relationship with, right? So that is important to stress, I think. But of course, I would absolutely agree on the fact that justification of the constitutive norm, that is exactly where it should, that's where the shoe hurts, right? So that is where one should be going. When it comes to the distinction between people as part and people as whole, indeed, it is the case that populism has been a political type of movement that particularly builds on this distinction. My colleague Valentina Pazzi wrote a beautiful book on the notion of people, in which she explains very carefully why is it the case that the people as parts in certain particular contexts, typically the pouvoir constituant type of context, why is it the case that the people as parts revendicates to speak for the people as whole? And why does this occur? When is it legitimate, etc.? I mean, this is the whole it's the whole Pandora's box of political philosophy, I would say, right? But if you're interested in the going into the relationship between people as parts and people as whole and its relationship to populism, I would absolutely advise you to read my colleague Valentina, who's great on this topic. And I think you're right. The real, the benchmark of what constitutional lawmaking would amount to in a situation in which we take it seriously at both at the national level and at the international level, is to make sure that those who are political citizens, or the people as whole, right? Those who are political citizens have incentives to make sure that all those who are social citizens, that is, who they're living with, are also attributed the connections or the protections connected to legal citizenship, right? Because the connection to legal citizenship is very important, especially in an international order that still has not banned the production of statelessness, right? So until that doesn't change, it is necessary to have the connection to legal citizenship, the passport, and the real, so to say, the real constitutionalist problem is to make sure that the political citizens have an interest in making sure that all the social citizens are included into the legal citizenship, right? And to make sure that these three circles coincide. And that is, of course, it's a serious problem. And there is a lot of empirical political science literature coming out, I mean, now over recent years, that have made some methodological breakthroughs in order to kind of assess what kind of political current best or less well accommodates for the interest of the major part of the population. And this is a fascinating branch of research, of course, but what comes out is that very seldom is it the case that the political citizens are actually promoting the interest of the social citizens, right? That has to be stressed. Finally, I won't get into the very complex question about the legitimacy of the international order and why certain subjects are recognized as acceptable subjects on the international scene and others are not. So I won't touch that because that would be it would require a ponencia on its own, right? But of course, I think that one thing that we should really stress is that the democracy ideals and the theory of democracy we have been operating with over the last, let's say, 100 years is extremely unprepared to answer the question about how the demos is supposed to be constructed. Okay, so if you look at, I mean, over the last maybe 20 years, we've been having big debate in democratic theory over the so-called problem of the boundary problem. It's called sometimes, and sometimes it's called the principles of democratic inclusion. And we have been making some progress in that area, but it's still the case that when you read the democratic theories in this, from a legal point of view, it gives me a little bit of allergy, you know. Sometimes I read, Habermas saying, okay, who are those who are belonging to the demos? Okay, it's those who belong to the legal community. Ooh, what is that? The Association of Lawyers? It's very vague, it's very unclear, and only in very recent years has there even been an interest in trying to making clear what does it even mean to be subject to the legal order from the democratic point of view, right? So there, a collaboration between democratic theorists and international lawyers, or lawyers also in other areas, would definitely be something to go forward with, because there's a huge amount of work to do there. Yeah. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Patricia. Muchas gracias, Natalia, también. Empezamos con la ronda de preguntas. Genoveva.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the lecture. I think that, I think that the distinction at a conceptual level that you make between physical space mobility and migration is really illuminating. And I must say also that I particularly appreciated the excursus into etymology, because I think that these things illuminate very much the topic. But I wanted to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, and say that even though I think that the conceptual distinction is very important, when it comes to a practical level, we may be purely trading labels for something that remains a problem. Right? I was thinking about particularly the slide in which you were talking about the visa legislation, and you were saying, look, the more stringent the conditions are, the more you're going to create a problem of illegal immigrants. So this is one of those issues in which the legislation itself creates the problem. And that's very interesting, but then someone can say, look, wait a second. I mean, there is a problem here that even if you had very, very lax, visa conditions or norms, you still would have a problem of people physically moving because they are fleeing poverty, and they're fleeing dictatorships, and they're fleeing political persecution, and they're trying to move, and you have masses of these people moving. So then you're going to have still a problem. You're not going to call them illegal immigrants, because now they're going to have visas. But the problem is still going to be there. And if the roots of that problem are not attacked, we still have a problem, call it by any name. So anyway, so that's aren't you, in a sense, aren't we trading labels here, and still the problem remains the same? That's it.
Can I answer?
Sure, I'm done.
I think you're right. I mean, the type of objection that I would come up with against this, against the way I structured the paper, is that it's sophist, right? It's a little bit sophist to make that argument, right? And I agree. I think that's what you're pointing to when you say it's a trading of labels, because the big problem will remain behind. And indeed, it looks very much like the type of argument that was popular in the 70s in the area of criminal law, right? So I'm thinking about the Danish school there, who said, well, crime is created by law. Yeah, but we still have a homicide, right? So I perfectly see what is, the sophist conclusions that could come out of it. Now, I want to point out that, for instance, the case of the visa, right? Now, what makes it sophist? It makes it sophist because I added, and I did that with knowing that it's a problem, I added the qualification, all other things being equal. So of course, all other things being equal, if you think of it as the number of individuals moving would stay the same, right? If that is your underlying empirical condition, then it is the case that the easier you want to make the visa, the less number of illegal migrants or unauthorized migrants. That's fine. The problem is the empirical condition of all other things being equal, right? Because we don't think that by changing the visa policy, everything stays the same, right? So a little bit, one of the problems that lies behind this, it concerns what can a state really do? So some migration scholars argue that, well, the state can't really do much because the events or the migration flows will occur anyway, right? So the state is in that sense a little bit depowered. At the same time, we've seen, I think that the pandemic has shown that, well, when the tiger of the state does not want to cut its claws, it is perfectly able to show it, right? So I would go slowly in saying, well, the state cannot do anything. It does a lot of things. However, what is for sure is that when we design the constitutive rules concerning, for instance, the visa policy, we can't say that I mean, this is something that it's a key political issue concerning this, I think, is that if we design the visa policy in such a way that it's not possible to apply for asylum, because you have to, in many cases, this is so, you have to be in the country, you can't apply from outside, you have to be in the country, but you cannot have arrived there illegally. Right? Okay. So basically, you've constructed a moment 22 into the law, right? In which it is not possible to apply for political asylum. And then we have a situation in which the very feature of political asylum becomes something like the spectacle. It becomes void. It has lost its rationale within the system, right? So I think that crime is not, well, crime is created by law. That won't cancel out the homicide. But it is the case that we want to have a discussion about what counts as homicide when that is so and why that is so. So I would embrace your sophist objection there, right? And I think you're right in making that objection. And I haven't figured out how to develop the theory beyond it. But I'm aware that a conclusion is, well, then, crime is created by law. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Si alguien quisiera de los espectadores que estén como asistentes hacer alguna pregunta por escrito en castellano, pueden hacerlo en el apartado de preguntas y respuestas. Alba.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Patricia, for your intervention. I have find it super interesting. Creo que voy a presentar mis preguntas en castellano, pero como prefieras, Patricia. Vale. Gracias también, Natalia, por tu intervención. Nada más comenzar tu intervención, Patricia, cuando empezaste hablando de la confrontación entre ordinary language versus language in law, y luego presentaste la estructura, que es lo que más me voy a centrar porque es lo que personalmente más me interesa, presentándola como en base a los hechos institucionales. Pensé que tu ponencia iba a confrontar un poco los problemas, ¿no?, que se pueden dar en base a los hechos institucionales creados a través de la aceptación social frente a los hechos institucionales normativos propios del derecho. Pero a lo largo de tu intervención he visto que este no es el punto teórico de partida y yo no conozco cuál es la perspectiva del realismo jurídico escandinavo. Entonces, mi primera pregunta sería si cuando desde el punto de vista del realismo jurídico escandinavo se habla de hechos institucionales, y de reglas constitutivas. Única y exclusivamente se habla desde la perspectiva de las reglas constitutivas en el derecho. Aprovecho para pedirte también lecturas en concreto para que me recomiendes. Y claro, esto, desde mi punto de vista, también se relacionaría con el problema del acceso epistémico que tú nos propones, ¿no? Porque cuando hablamos de hechos institucionales con una base en la aceptación colectiva, en el convencionalismo, sí que parece que este acceso epistémico existe, pero que puede generar dudas en cuanto a cuál es exactamente el contenido de estos hechos institucionales. Sin embargo, cuando hablamos de hechos institucionales codificados, regulados por el derecho, mi intuición es pensar que es algo mucho más claro, más nítido y que podríamos encontrar respuesta en algún ordenamiento jurídico, dejando de lado los problemas que pueden existir al hablar de un ordenamiento jurídico internacional, etc. Y por último, también, claro, la respuesta sería distinta si hablamos de un tema que también tanto Natalia como Patricia presentasteis respecto a la justificación de estas reglas constitutivas, porque ambas planteasteis que, claro, esto es un problema cuando hablamos de hechos institucionales que forman parte ya del derecho codificado, porque tiene que haber una legitimación, etcétera. Y parece que este problema ya no existe si estamos hablando de hechos institucionales con una base social, porque la justificación sería la aceptación colectiva y esto serviría ya como legitimación de estos hechos institucionales más sociales. Gracias.
Patricia, si quieres contestar.
Okay, so I can answer in English, I hope. Okay, so I would say that in the case of, let me start by the Scandinavians, I would say it makes a little bit of difference who you look at. It is clear that in Olivekrona, the rules that we would be looking at are the constitutive rules of law, right? He does make, however, a discussion that is about constitutive rules in economy, right? So he's got an argument about the unit of currency, right? And his first argument is really about currency, because he thinks that currency works in a way that is similar to the institutional factors I've described it, right? And it's true that in the case of currency, it's a little bit, in the case of money, it's a little bit tricky whether we are saying that. And there's two different philosophies of money here, right? There's some people who would claim that the ultimate basis of the currency is the law, right? And there's another group of people who would say, no, the ultimate basis of that is social acceptance. And I think that a little bit depends on what kind of philosophy of money you're willing to embrace. But having flagged that ambiguity, I would say that Olivekrona goes to the constitutive rules in law, whereas in Hägerström, this is not yet clear. In Hägerström, it's more, he treats both social acceptance, indeed, and that is because he treats law in parallel to religion, right? So he thinks that there is a collective belief system that is at play, and it doesn't really matter for him whether he's discussing religion or if it's discussing law, because they both have this feature of having a collective set of beliefs, right? And in that sense, I would say that he's vaguer than Olivekrona. Olivekrona is much sharper on this. Okay, so that was just the references there. Of course, the fact that something is socially accepted, or at least, because usually when we say that something is socially accepted, we often mean there is there's like no violent objection to it. Right? So we usually take absence of rebellion as being a form of acceptance, right? Which not always is perhaps justified, right? But when we speak of acceptance, it is still the case that what is accepted isn't justified, right? So the mere presence of the acceptance is still not enough to make it justified, right? And of course, as we see, a lot of things that we used to think were acceptable, with very small changes, have now come across as unacceptable. I mean, think of the fact that I'm not sure then that, you know, if we meet and we're not vaccinated, that will give you small kisses on the cheeks, right? I used to do that, but I don't do that anymore because it's just socially unacceptable, right? And of course, these things may change with very rapidly. So a caution there about acceptance on one hand, it's justification. I mean, you could have a world in which everybody thinks it's perfectly okay to torture babies, and it would still not be okay to torture babies, right? So that distinction, I think, would be valuable to uphold. Now, which are the limits to the convention that a institutional fact is grounded on? I don't have a good answer to that, but I do understand that that is a really tricky question. So to understand, because of course we do understand that the institutional fact is contingent because it could have been designed in a different way, but it couldn't have been designed in just whatsoever way, right? So, so the question is, what kind of limits are there to the design of institutional facts, right? And of course, that is dependent on how we perceive the ratio materiae of that institutional fact. But of course, I know it's a problem. I don't have an answer.
Muchas gracias. Julieta, ¿tiene una palabra?
Sí, muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en castellano para que sea más fluido. Primero, realmente no tengo críticas con respecto a la idea de la ciudadanía, a la teoría funcional de la ciudadanía, porque como bien sabes, soy, digamos, estoy muy... mis intuiciones están muy hacia el realismo escandinavo y a toda la cuestión, digamos, semántica en relación con esto. Pero, y me parece además excelente, perdón, y este es un comentario además de una pregunta, me parece excelente ver la ciudadanía desde este sentido para justamente poner el acento en que todos estos hechos condicionales que se toman como cuestiones naturales, es decir, que pensar que por naturalmente nacer en un sitio necesariamente eso te convierte en un ciudadano. Esto usualmente no se piensa de esta forma y creo que la teoría funcionalista de la ciudadanía que subyace detrás de tu presentación es excelente para comenzar a discutir estas cosas. Sobre todo porque la ciudadanía, como has sostenido en tu libro de la teoría funcionalista de la ciudadanía, es tanto un mecanismo de inclusión como de exclusión. En este sentido, no sé si tendrás una respuesta para esto y quizás también es una pregunta para Natalia Castro, a ver si las dos... porque quiero ir un poquito más allá de la teoría en sí, con la cual estoy completamente de acuerdo. ¿Cómo sería, digamos, cuáles serían los criterios para seleccionar estos hechos condicionantes? Digamos, porque, digamos, ¿cuánto influiría en el momento de seleccionar estos hechos condicionantes lo que reconoces como el significado político y el significado sociológico de ciudadanía y que tratas muy bien, digamos, sobre todo en el libro, en este libro? Lo mismo, Natalia, si quiere hacer algún comentario con respecto a cuáles serían algunos criterios para llevar adelante esta selección de hechos condicionantes. Y luego la segunda pregunta, que también puede ser para las dos, y que quizás me estoy yendo de la presentación, pero se me ha ocurrido escuchando el debate, es si les parece que esta cuestión con respecto al, por ejemplo, al concepto de ciudadanía, a la creación de reglas constitutivas que determinen qué significa ser un migrante o qué significa ser un ciudadano, sea algo que deba, por el contexto sobre todo actual, deba seguir siendo reservado a los estados, entendidos los estados, digamos, como los detentores de esta soberanía que en los últimos años, como vienen, digamos, discutiendo, se está diluyendo o está cambiando, y si en este sentido ustedes piensan que necesariamente para tener una buena, digamos, un buen entendimiento de las migraciones, un buen, digamos, no lograr que todos tengamos el derecho a migrar, pero no tengamos el derecho de ser recibidos, pongamos por caso, en otros lugares y adoptar determinados estatus, o si simplemente se debe dejar hacer a cada estado como ha sido hasta ahora. Muchísimas gracias, espero que se haya entendido, fue un poco...
Natalia, should you start?
Ok, bueno, muchas gracias por las preguntas. Creo que es una cuestión muy interesante y creo que la respuesta varía mucho realmente si uno la piensa en derecho interno o en derecho internacional. Así que yo creo que si uno lo piensa en derecho internacional, y hasta donde yo conozco, digamos, en lo que ha sido escrito y desarrollado por muchos autores en relación con el concepto de comunidad internacional y de comunidad política en derecho internacional y de cómo se ingresa a esa comunidad de tomadores de decisiones, que sería como el equivalente del concepto de ciudadanía en el derecho internacional, pues la respuesta tal vez tiene que ver con que los hechos condicionantes a los que tú te refieres no pueden ser únicos. Es decir, van a tener que ser hechos condicionantes que dependen del tipo de decisión y del tipo de norma que se busca aplicar, ¿sí? Algunos autores, por ejemplo, dicen que la comunidad internacional tiene una configuración variable según el tema del que se esté hablando. Entonces, en materia de derechos humanos, por ejemplo, la comunidad internacional es una. Pero en materia, por ejemplo, de definición de fronteras y de regulación de espacios internacionales es otra, ¿sí? Porque los afectados y los beneficiarios de las decisiones no son necesariamente los mismos. Y desde ese punto de vista, entonces, los hechos condicionantes deberían variar, ¿sí? Ahora, si tratamos de llevar ese concepto de comunidad política, yo lo estoy tomando como quiénes serían los que tienen el poder de participar en la creación de las normas, ¿cierto? Porque, digamos, dentro de las posibilidades de posición jurídica internacional, derechos y obligaciones, la más alta es justamente el poder de crear normas. Pero si uno simplemente lo limita a creación de derechos y obligaciones, pues igual tendrá hechos condicionantes distintos, porque digamos que no creo que la categoría pueda ser única, sino que tendremos que ver específicamente de qué posición jurídica hablamos, porque la categoría como tal, el status civitatis a nivel internacional, no es uno solo, sino que va a depender de para qué lo necesitemos. Es un poco lo que decía Patricia de no podemos poner el carro antes que los caballos, necesitamos saber para qué queremos la personalidad jurídica internacional, porque eso depende de qué derechos y qué obligaciones queremos atribuir y qué efecto práctico queremos para ellos. Yo no creo que pueda ser uno solo, creo que justamente esa es la dificultad y por eso es tan difícil plantear, digamos, una norma general a nivel internacional de quién es sujeto y qué engloba la categoría de sujeto, porque finalmente eso depende de en qué campo estemos hablando. El individuo es sujeto en derecho penal internacional y se puede ver atribuidas unas sanciones, pero no es sujeto en derecho internacional del medio ambiente, por ejemplo, porque allí se ha considerado que lo que es importante es otra cosa. ¿Me explico? Entonces creo que el debate avanza más bien hacia hechos condicionados diferentes dependiendo del campo de las normas y del contenido de las posiciones jurídicas creadas por los estados. Creo que eso sería. Y en relación con el segundo punto, lo de la soberanía, yo creo que la soberanía, si algún día existió completamente, hoy es claro que es más una pretensión que una realidad. Es decir, la idea de que la soberanía es solamente como poder que permite autolimitarse y limitar los demás poderes en la esfera jurídica, creo que es una pretensión más que otra cosa. Y pensar que solo el Estado lo tiene es realmente una ilusión. Es decir, hoy en día los grados de soberanía o más bien de poder no es una cuestión ni siquiera jurídica, es una cuestión de geopolítica y de relaciones internacionales. Con lo cual, reconocer esa realidad me parece que es una deuda del sistema jurídico en relación con esta cuestión de la migración, pero con muchas otras, o sea, el tema de los derechos humanos, el tema del comercio internacional, la inversión extranjera, es decir, los límites de la efectividad de todas esas normas están dados por los límites de la propia soberanía de los estados. Entonces, reconocer que esa es una ficción y que hoy en día el mapa de la distribución de poder está incompleto si no se tienen en cuenta los otros sujetos y actores, pues creo que es una deuda, es algo que hay que hacer para poder intentar de alguna forma darle un contenido a estas categorías que pueda tener algún grado de efectividad. De otra manera, pues creo que seguimos en lo mismo. Gracias.
Patricia.
Okay, so I'll try to say something short, but conclusive on the 2 points. We'll see. So I think that one important thing about the selection of conditioning facts is that we need to be having a very serious debate about what we think are the conditional facts, right? And what we do instead is that we just drink whatever they give us, you know. Of course, what happens then is that we tend to think that there's some kind of necessity of accepting ideas that kind of serpent around in the social discourse concerning matters such as citizenship and migration, right? So we seem to be thinking that there's something kind of natural about, I don't know, birthright citizenship or ex juris sanguinis, ex juris soli, or whatever. And the fact that we accept the naturalness of it is in itself I would say, an intellectual impediment, right? So I really want to advocate for the position that we gain in political, in moral, and in legal empowerment by understanding that conventions can be made in different ways, right? So by exploring the way the contingent surrounds us, we gain in liberty rather than the opposite. I think that is an important point to make. And the second thing is that for a while, I thought that the big deal with this migration rights regime that we're under is about sovereignty. And that's how I first kind of went about. But as time has gone by, I'm not 100% sure that I swallow that story anymore. And I think here's why. I mean, you could think of the word, this is really, really, really super stripped down to the bone, almost so simplified that it's wrong. Okay, so bear with me here. But you could say that the international migration regime is basically a set of let's say 4 points. Okay, it's obligatory that all states let leave, right to leave. Everyone has it, right? Besides justified acceptation. Right? 2, it is obligatory that the state of nationality lets its citizens enter. Okay, so you have a right to enter, but only in your own state, right? And then you have asylum and a few, family reunification, a few other rights, but asylum is the core right, where it is obligatory that the state that comes into contact with a person who has a well-grounded fear of prosecution assesses the possibility of permitting entry. So you don't have a right to asylum, you have a right to seek asylum, right? And then 4th, there's a duty that corresponds to the state, to the state's right to exclude. And that duty is that it is obligatory that non-nationals who want to be allowed entry apply for permission to do so, right? Now, notice that how this world is constructed is apparently, in order to have a place where to be, you need citizenship. But at the same time, states are allowed to attribute citizenship on a discretionary basis. And there is no ban on the creation of statelessness. So basically, the way the constitutive rules have been set up in this play, so to say, is such that there is no way to play this game unless it creates chaos, right? So it will always create some form of negative externalities. So you give me some that I don't like, and I'll give them to someone else, and and it will continue in this buck passing activity because of how it is structured. And I thought for a long while that this is really a question about should the state have a right to exclude. But the more I thought about it, the more I think that the 2 positions at play is the old UN position, or the position taken by Luigi Ferraioli, for instance, right, who says that, well, it's if it is permitted for every person to leave, then it has to be permitted for every person also to enter, right? And counter, you have the proposition of many others who say, no, it can't work that way. If it is permitted that any person leaves a country, it is only obligatory for the state to let leave. Now, this is not really about sovereignty. This is about whether the ratio materiae of those rights are bodies moving in space, because if it is bodies moving in space, then it is the case then that if you exit from here, you will enter somewhere. But if the ratio materiae isn't bodies moving in space, but simply institutional facts, right? The question of labeling. If that is what we're discussing, it makes perfect sense to say, I want to have an obligation to let leave, right? So what I think this point is about is a much more serious issue about, being clear about what we actually mean, so we can pull out the truth makers of the various positions at play. And only by discussing the truth makers of the various positions are we going to make any progress, I think. Thanks.
Muchas gracias a ambas. Hay una última pregunta. Hay una pregunta por parte de Mariana Briones que leeré. Me interesa conocer de Patricia cuál es la concepción que utilizas de obstáculo epistemológico. Y Piero, te pido por favor que hagas tu pregunta, pero te solicito una máxima brevedad porque ya estamos fuera de tiempo.
Entonces hago la pregunta y luego que Patricia responda a la otra pregunta.
No, Patricia puede responder a las dos preguntas.
Okay, so I understand one was about the epistemological hinder.
Exacto.
And I don't really have a conception about that. I'm far too sloppy and I would need to study. But what I can say more generally is I understand that if you haven't thought through your basic concepts and you're unsure about whether you're referring to an institutional fact or to an empirical fact, that seems like an hinder somehow. It seems something that should be, an issue that should be ironed out. But I admit I don't really have a conception here.
Okay, thank you. Piero.
Bueno, gracias, Patricia. Me gustó mucho tu exposición y parte de tu desarrollo de teoría, pero hay algo que todavía me increpa, y es, ¿tu teoría es descriptiva o normativa? Porque veo que te interesa mucho el problema descriptivo, y hasta ahí estoy muy feliz, pero luego entras en lo que para mí son las trampas del derecho internacional, y es que los internacionalistas están muy preocupados por justificar, y a la vez de justificar quieren hacer propuestas normativas, y luego quieren hacer crítica, y la descripción queda ahí en un plano muy, muy oscuro, y ya al final no entendemos. Entonces, ¿cuál es el objetivo último? Explicar simplemente de manera descriptiva, ¿y desde qué perspectiva? ¿Jurídica, política o sociológica? Porque también aquí política y derecho sobre todo se mezclan con mucha facilidad, pero jurídicamente y desde la perspectiva global, porque también lo podemos ver, derecho internacional, derecho nacional, desde la perspectiva global creo que ¿qué es un migrante? O en contraposición, ¿qué es un nacional? Es algo muy sencillo. Nacional es al que un Estado reconoce como su propio ciudadano. En este mismo sentido también te plantearía, lo que nos has expuesto no es más bien una teoría de la extranjería, no tanto de la migración, sino de la extranjería, porque ya quedó claro que el movimiento es una cuestión irrelevante en tu teoría, pero una persona puede ser perfectamente extranjera en la misma tierra en la que nació y en la que fue criada. Nada más eso, gracias.
Good. I don't have a very good answer, but I can say that I'm foremost interested in the descriptive question. And the reason why I'm interested in the descriptive question is that I suspect that if the matter isn't correctly described, no normative solutions will be acceptable, right? So the reason why I'm interested in setting up the descriptive part is that I suspect that otherwise, it becomes a question of people's preferences. And I wouldn't want it to be a question of preferences. I would want it to be a question of reason, right? And in order for that to be a question of reason, we have to find out what is the right questions to even be starting to ask, right? So I would view the project as a project that is first descriptive, yeah. Is it about foreignness? I wouldn't know. I'm also a little bit unsure whether it is a project in law or in political science, and perhaps the reason why I'm unsure about that is that I divide the subject matters only for the purpose of having a reasonable chunk of books to read, right? But I'm driven by the object as such, right? So I'm interested in what is it about the fact that people move across borders that engender these types of norms And what does it say about the kind of political and social arrangements we have? So I know it's an unsatisfactory answer, but I'm afraid that that's the only one I'll be able to give.
Muchas gracias. Con esto cerramos el panel. Quiero agradecer a Patricia, a Natalia, a todos los que han estado presentes. Y hacemos una pausa, Carmen, ¿de cuántos minutos? ¿5? Hasta el siguiente panel.
5 minutos y volvemos.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias a todos.